the 25th of February, 2025. G-Dragon returns with a new release titled Übermensch. The album is received mostly positively and there is no major public controversy. Many even praise G-Dragon's interpretation of the term. But is it really unproblematic, or are there subtle right-wing dog whistles, anti-Semitic references, or even a fascist ideology hidden beneath the surface? Can one, in light of these aspects, draw the conclusion that G-Dragon is a fascist? The overwhelmingly positive public response and discourse surrounding G-Dragon's new release, Übermensch, has faced little critical scrutiny. On YouTube, for instance, there is barely any serious critical reflection. My ranking video has so far been the only major platform for discussion on YouTube, and even that only briefly touched on the issue. While elsewhere, critical debates remain marginal and scattered. Today, I will provide a political analysis of G-Dragon's Übermensch and explore the controversies that arise at the intersection of ideology, social power structures, and culture. I intend to elucidate key facts alongside historical casualties that, I am certain, are either overlooked or insufficiently comprehended by many who defend G-Dragon, reflecting a broader deficit in critical consciousness regarding the ideological and structural dynamics involved. Therefore, we begin first with the historical significance and burden of the term Übermensch. Although it originally stems from Nietzsche and represents a philosophical idea, the concept of a human who overcomes themselves, questions old values, and creates a new ethic, it was distorted by the National Socialists and turned into an instrument of their racist, anti-Semitic ideology. Nietzsche never spoke of racial superiority, yet the Nazis transferred the term into a biologically racist context and constructed from it their ideal of the Aryan master race. This ideological reinterpretation also left deep traces on the linguistic level. The term Übermensch underwent a pejorative shift in meaning, from an originally transcendental, metaphorical, philosophical conception to a politically contaminated expression. This is fact. A historical and linguistic occurrence. The National Socialist resemanticization triggered a discourse semantic rupture. Ultimately, if one intends to interpret the linguistic semantics recursively, this reproduces the rupture and thereby trivializes its ideological charge. And this is precisely where the problem lies. Many of those defending G-Dragon today either ignore this semantic rupture or remain unaware of its broader ramifications. This is not merely about historical detail, but about a deeper failure to grasp the political function of language and the accountability that accompanies its deployment, especially when it carries ideological resonance. Those who claim that terms like Übermensch originally didn't mean anything bad not only ignore the historical resemantization of the term, but also completely disregard the perspective of its victims. What is lacking is historical awareness, empathy toward those who suffered as a result of this very reinterpretation, and a reflective engagement with symbolic violence. Especially in Germany, there exists a well-defined social practice regarding the use of certain terms and symbols. Two particularly striking examples are the swastika and the term Untermensch. The swastika, too, had a different meaning before its appropriation by National Socialism, as a religious and cultural symbol across various Asian contexts. And yet today, particularly within Germany and Europe, it is inextricably linked to Nazi ideology. Those who use it cannot hide behind its original meaning. No matter how brilliant or profound the original philosophy behind the term Übermensch may be, the recursive semantic shift brought about by its ideological appropriation in a context of such destruction must never be ignored or downplayed. Words are not neutral vessels. They carry history, pain, and suffering. To disregard this burden is to negate the memory of millions of victims and the immeasurable human suffering tied to this redefinition. Language lives within social discourse, and once a term becomes saturated with such immense symbolic violence, the original idea loses its innocence. This is not merely a matter of knowledge or historical literacy. It is about respect, empathy, and responsibility toward those who suffered under the ideology in question. It is therefore not only an issue of historical awareness, but a moral obligation to acknowledge the weight such language carries. This is precisely why, in Germany, terms like Untermensch are treated with the same sensitivity as the N-word. They are socially condemned and excluded from everyday usage. Germany has even gone so far as to legally prohibit the reproduction of symbols like the swastika or the Hitler salute. This demonstrates the seriousness with which remembrance and accountability are approached here, and this is not some progressive convention, but the bare minimum of respect. I am aware that this topic may initially seem unfamiliar or even disconcerting to those outside the German-speaking world. That is precisely why I approach it not only through the lens of semantic transformation, but also from a structural linguistic perspective, to show how deeply entrenched the term's problematic ideological charge is, and why its use today is not only inappropriate, but fundamentally misguided. The terms Übermensch and Untermensch are intricately linked, both semantically and structurally. Both consist of a clearly defined composition, the prefix über or unter, and the root word Mensch, human. Morphologically, they are mirror images, phonetically resonant and conceptually arranged as binary opposites, comparable to well-known antonym pairs such as white and black, rich and poor, or good and evil. This linguistic structure was deliberately employed in National Socialist discourse to construct a binary worldview. The Übermensch represented the supposedly valuable, superior human being, while the Untermensch was framed as inferior, excluded, and dehumanized. Particularly insidious was the fact that the term Untermensch was primarily used for racist and anti-Semitic devaluation, especially directed against Jews, but also against others marked as foreign or subhuman. In this function, Untermensch serves a comparable ideological function to racial slurs such as the N-word, particularly in its capacity to enact linguistic violence. Even in today's German language discourse, Untermensch is therefore clearly regarded as anti-Semitic, racist, and part of a fascist linguistic apparatus. It is not merely a historical term, but a symbol of systemic violence, one whose reuse entails a conscious or unconscious reproduction of the very ideology it once served. When engaging with terms such as Untermensch or Übermensch, a similar sensitivity should apply, especially from a progressive perspective as with the N-word. Within leftist and progressive discourses, the convention is not to speak over those affected, but rather to actively seek their perspectives regarding how they feel about certain terms and what impact these have on them. Before addressing the public representation of G-Dragon's Übermensch release in Germany, as well as the perspectives of affected groups, I would first like to differentiate and broaden the picture through anecdotal and representative narration to provide a view of those affected, one that is inaccessible to many. After I first brought up the topic in the video, and in several conversations with affected people, my attitude toward G-Dragon's use of the term was initially somewhat moderate. I considered it a conscious and edgy provocation, or perhaps an unreflective, context-detached reinterpretation, an assessment that in hindsight was very liberal. Since then, I have engaged more intensively with the topic and had conversations with people affected by racist or anti-Semitic language. Although most of them had no connection to K-pop, which is why I had to explain a lot to those affected, the viewpoints expressed were unambiguous, which I will elaborate on in more detail later. The prevailing discourse on the internet can be analytically bifurcated into two predominant strata. Firstly, the international reactions emanating from agents beyond the German-speaking and culturally historical German milieu. And secondly, the distinctly German-speaking perspectives. Within the international perspective, two groups can again be distinguished. On the one hand, there is a considerable cohort showing apathy or silence on the issue. Further content-related discussion about this group is unnecessary. On the other hand, there are individual voices that actively defend G-Dragon. However, there appears to be a lack of any in-depth or critical discourse with the term Übermensch in international videos, comments, or contributions. The German language sphere presents a contrasting picture. Here there is, at least in the public online discourse, an almost universal agreement. The use of the term has been sharply criticized. In my research, I actually found only one person who defended G-Dragon on this issue, but their argumentation remained superficial and little reflective. In opposition, German language reactions were largely nuanced, historically grounded, and sensitive to language. The evident divide underscores how understanding and assessment of these terms depend heavily on context. Regrettably, the lone defender of G-Dragon within the German language discourse echoed a line of reasoning consistent with numerous international stances, despite providing little detailed analysis. The pivotal argument employed across these defenses consistently hinges on invoking Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. In debates I participated in, this argument was repeated almost robotically, as if it provided an unrestricted pass to trivialize the issue. There is no need for me to further elaborate on why this reasoning is reductive and unsustainable. I have already comprehensively refuted this argument in the video, and it lacks any foundational validity. The reason I bring it up is that this singular fixation on Nietzsche exemplifies the considerable alienation from the historical and socio-political context of the term. This alienation is presumably why G-Dragon's use of Übermensch is defended so passionately, not out of hostility, but due to ignorance or cultural distance. Within German language discourse, many arguments recur, revealing a distinct substantive consensus. Yet the critique extends beyond the term Übermensch itself to encompass the visual dimension. Colors, fonts, typography, and symbolic references are similarly examined. Less frequently addressed, however, is the linguistic structural perspective, a facet that has already been critically examined and substantiated within the scope of my contribution. The term Übermensch is by no means the sole issue. It rather symbolizes a spectrum of problematic elements embedded within G-Dragon's release. And indeed, we arrive at the 88. Though a minor point in my overall argument, I mention it here for completeness, despite my personal fatigue with the topic. Of course, I know that G-Dragon was born in 1988. Nevertheless, the question arises, why in particular, for this release, with all its other problematic symbols, is the decision made to prominently display this number? And before someone tries again to argue with recursive semantics, please don't. I know that one of the biggest German streamers also carries 88 in his name, for exactly the same reason, because it is his birth year. But firstly, I also do not find that unproblematic, and secondly, this person is clearly not thoughtful or reflective. Anyone familiar with German politics and who knows him is aware that he frequently employs right-wing rhetoric, displays considerable naivety, and at times perpetuates problematic narratives that cannot be overlooked. In Germany, the number 88 carries significant socio-political connotations. It is, for example, banned as a jersey number in football and is generally considered a right-wing extremist symbol. For those who do not know, the 8 stands for the 8th letter of the alphabet, H. 88 is thus read as a code for Heil Hitler. As I said, among the various arguments, this one carries the least weight. Nevertheless, within the broader context of the release's symbolism, it remains a meaningful element and contributes to a comprehensive picture that cannot be dismissed. Equally central to the word itself is the visual design, especially the choice of colors and the font. Because what is presented here not only recalls right-wing extremist rock aesthetics in general, but exhibits clear aesthetic parallels to Nazi iconography. Yes, I know that certain colors and fonts were not invented by National Socialism historically, but appropriated. But precisely for this reason, one should handle their combination with particular sensitivity, especially when used together with a term like Übermensch. The word alone would already be highly problematic, not least because G-Dragon does not translate it, but explicitly uses it in the German language. Yet in combination with the color design, the typographic design choices, and symbols such as 88, a cohesive whole forms that transcends isolated components. As has been mentioned multiple times in the discourse, many people have expressed considerable unease at the sight of this release. Choosing such a heavily charged aesthetic against this background appears not only problematic, it's downright absurd. Another significant aspect of context, which I mentioned in the last video but have not yet discussed in detail, and which remains underexplored in the present debate, pertains to the release's timing. As I remarked in relation to Modehouse in the last video, Artemis at that time postponed its Burn release out of respect for the devastating wildfires, a decision I deemed notably progressive and responsible. In sharp opposition and contrast, G-Dragon released his Übermensch exactly 2 days after the Bundestag election in Germany. For those curious about the election's outcome, an additional dimension emerges, which casts the timing decision in a more critical light. Those wondering about the outcome of the Bundestag election, the only truly electable party, Die Linke, achieved a strong result with over 8%. However, all other parties fall within the right-to-right centrist spectrum. Particularly, the two frontrunners are very right-wing parties. The CDU is often described as right conservative, a designation I consider to be an understatement considering their proclamation. In many respects, the CDU resembles the AfD, which has rightly been classified by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution as right-wing extremist. I do not intend to go into all the errors and problems of the parties here, be it the AfD, which is absolutely neoliberal, or I'm not even sure if neoliberal would be an understatement for the AfD, and which should be morally critically assessed in nearly all respects. The fact is that the AfD was able to achieve a historic electoral success in this election, the unfortunately highest in their party history. And precisely at this moment, when these two right-wing parties, one of which is clearly right-wing extremist, achieve electoral victories and the shift to the right becomes tangible in Germany and Europe, G-Dragon releases a work with a term that evokes right-wing extremist associations, combined with visual design and symbolism strongly reminiscent of right-wing imagery. This may be a coincidence, but it does not have to be. If we do not view this in isolation, but rather as an interplay of release timing, color choice, design aesthetics, symbolism, and the use of such a misanthropic word, it becomes clear. This is not about edginess, polemics, or provocation. This is to be understood as a deliberate reenactment of misanthropic ideologies and is ethically highly reprehensible. G-Dragon is going on tour, and I personally consider it sheer insolence that Germany in particular is supposed to be part of this tour. In the country whose history has been profoundly shaped by exactly those ideologies that are visually and linguistically referenced here. What makes it even more bitter is that there is virtually no backlash in Germany, no outcry, no extensive discourse, and And this in a context that would actually require the utmost sensitivity, or rather, the backlash is simply too small. One reason for this is certainly that K-pop in Germany, unlike in Asia or the USA, is not a real mainstream phenomenon. It takes place more at the margins, without major media attention. But another far more disturbing reason is the rightward political shift in society, which no longer affects only political debates but also erodes our cultural awareness. I had honestly hoped that at least the progressive part of the subculture in Germany would react to something like this reflectively, loudly, and visibly. Instead, nothing happens. Of course, there are people who see this critically, and their arguments are often clever, reflective, and well-founded. But in the broad mass, they are simply too quiet, too few. And that is exactly the real problem. If even such a clearly charged constellation of symbols, from language to colors to the release shortly after a historic victory of the extreme right, is no longer collectively questioned, then we have reached a point where ideological aesthetics are simply approved without critical examination. After virtually every argument attempting to defend G-Dragon and his release has been refuted, a central question arises. What exactly is G-Dragon? Or more precisely, how should he and this release be classified? To be blunt, the release expresses a deeply hostile stance toward humanity. It is anti-Semitic, racist, othering European history, and ultimately a slap in the face to all those affected by right-wing violence, exclusion, and systemic discrimination. Does this argument also apply to G-Dragon himself? My answer is no, at least not directly. Assuming the very best case scenario, there are only two possibilities. He had no knowledge of the problematic symbolism, or it was an intentional provocation, either by him or his label. It seems unlikely to me that he had no influence or knowledge here. I want to deliberately exclude the topic of repression within K-pop companies, not because it is irrelevant, but because it would mislead two things. First, it would relativize the responsibility for the inhumane content. Second, it simply does not apply here. Even if G-Dragon were restricted by repression, there are ethical boundaries that cannot be excused by any form of repression. Because even if G-Dragon were restricted in a relationship of repression, there are moral boundaries, the crossing of which cannot be justified by any relationship of repression. If he truly had no knowledge about the problematic symbolism, that would be at the very least strange. In hardly any text on historical semantics or symbol analysis is the reference to the pejorative, inhumane connotations of the used term and design missing. With his worldwide visibility and enormous influence, G-Dragon carries considerable responsibility. Ignorance might be a weak alibi, and considering his previous artistic references, it also seems unlikely. It would at least be strange if he was unaware of the problematic, pejorative, and inhumane connotations of the symbols or terms used. These connotations are widely known and referenced in historical semantics and symbol analyses. Looking at his own statement, the situation becomes even more questionable. G-Dragon did not address the inhumane symbolism directly, but defended the term purely through Nietzsche's original meaning. By doing so, he repeats exactly the argument often used in debates about semantic recontextualization, yet remains disturbingly one-dimensional. This does not come across as a naive misunderstanding, but as a deliberate avoidance of substantive criticism. Instead of engaging with the controversy, he shifts the focus to Nietzsche's philosophy, tactically dodging the issue. The result is a reiteration of far-right imagery. Art may provoke, but it may never affirm inhumanity. Quality satire, good art, and thoughtful provocation all have one thing in common. They negate and reject harmful ideologies even when depicting them. This is the so-called meta-premise, the crucial boundary in art, which requires analysis of the meta-level to determine if a position negates or affirms inhuman views. Right-wing music, including right-wing rock, affirms these ideologies instead of denying them. G-Dragon maintains an unclear position by purposely sidestepping points of contention both within and outside his art. This is evident from the lack of critical reflection and any clear distancing from inhumane interpretations. He neither openly condemns nor clarifies his stance. Therefore, it appears to be a strategic choice to place provocation and ambivalence above responsibility. He uses symbolism to generate attention rather than to negotiate meaningful content, and he forgoes the meta-level reflection that would elevate polemics into critical art. Ultimately, this is not a harmless artistic experiment, but an example of aestheticized irresponsibility disguised as intellectual reference. G-Dragon is neither a convinced right-winger nor an anti-humanist. However, he can be seen as a strategic, opportunistic artist who avoids addressing the moral implications of his work. His provocation comes at a high price, as it does not foster societal debate or expose ideology critically, but instead reproduces problematic narratives. Art that provokes must always reject inhumanity. Crossing this boundary places an artist on a dangerous side of history, whether consciously or through negligence. In this light, G-Dragon's release should be understood as a failure to uphold this responsibility. Regarding the core issue we have arrived at, I was already at the time of my ranking video. That the release clearly represents a clear expression of disdain for marginalized communities and that G-Dragon is morally very questionable was fundamentally already clear to me back then. Also, many of the arguments I presented in the video were largely known to me except for the fact that G-Dragon will probably also tour in Germany. What has changed since the time of the video until today is, on the one hand, my personal attitude towards G-Dragon, and on the other hand, the perspective I have gained through conversations with affected people. As I already anecdotally mentioned in the video, I have engaged extensively with persons who are directly affected by this issue. As a person of color myself, nevertheless, it was important to me to see that there is a consensus among marginalized individuals, since terms such as Untermensch and Übermensch served as instruments of oppression not only against Jewish citizens, but against all who did not fit into the racist worldview of the so-called master race, that is, against all who were not considered Aryans or Übermenschen. What has especially changed for me through this exchange is the degree of condemnation and critical perspective on G-Dragon. In contrast to my former stance in the ranking video, I am now clearly more critical. Only through conversations with those affected did it become clear to me how absurd it is to even try to defend G-Dragon. Practically every person I spoke to agreed. This should never be reiterated. It is hostile to human dignity and dehumanizing.
Particularly interesting was also the question whether such a right of spread is prevalent in K-pop culture, because I shocked some friends and fellow students when we talked about it. In such debates, the established opinions of those affected are paramount. A good example of this is POCs in the handling of the N-word. It must never be reproduced by non-affected persons, and when it is used by POCs, it is usually with the aim to undermine the word's oppressive societal impact.
It is similar with the respectful addressing of non-binary persons, where it is important to take their pronouns seriously and try to use them correctly. What is the conclusion from all this?
The release is fundamentally dehumanizing
and hostile to human dignity. While I cannot definitively gauge G-Dragon's personal convictions, it is clear that these are neither inadvertent errors nor lapses in judgment, but a deliberate choice and an outright manifestation of disrespect.
G-Dragon may perhaps not be an anti-Semite, a fascist, or even categorized within the right-wing spectrum,
but he is an artist, musician, a legend in K-pop wielding tremendous influence. Nevertheless, his approach is provocatively polemical, eschewing critical and reflective discourse in favor of a deeply problematic posture. Following this release, my assessment of G-Dragon is unequivocal. A deeply contemptible person.